Hello, and welcome back to the Diogenes Project. I'm your host, Christopher Willingham, and together we will chew our way through Wokeism in search of an honest man, or woman, or they, them. I'm just kidding. There's nothing honest about any of that. Remember, if you enjoy the content on the Diogenes podcast, please subscribe and tell your friends to join the pack. Also, remember to leave a like so that we can boost the channel in the suggestions and reach more viewers. Today, we will conclude the reading of my essay, Danse Macabre. This has been a long slog, I know, especially as my non-existent video editing skills require me to complete these readings in one take, or 10. For those who have listened to any or all of these consecutive episodes, I offer my amazement and my humble thanks. I welcome your feedback and any and all constructive suggestions and reasoned and respectful arguments. The next series of offerings on this podcast will include selections from books in the larger Diogenes Project, including The Disasters of Woke and the soon-to-be-printed Emphatic Caprices. I will also be inaugurating a series of short takes entitled Dog Bites, with pithy, pith, comments on issues of the day. Stay tuned for these as well as updates on the coming website, where you can purchase my lavishly illustrated books, archival prints of the original artworks, and other unique items. Now, without further ado, Danse Macabre. The conclusion is entitled Part 7, Inherit the Wind. He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind. Proverbs 11:29. The leftification of the West is a systematic dehumanization that conduces to violence, murder, and assassination in the false cause of social justice. It is an epic narrative of gaslighting, language games, and outright lies played to seize and secure power. It is a doctrine of hate wrapped in egalitarian platitudes. Journalist Andy Ngo, author of Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, and himself a victim of a near-fatal Antifa attack and ongoing death threats, mused in the days after Charlie Kirk's murder, quote, "I hope that it's been eye-opening for the public to see the bloodlust that exists, not just on the fringe left, obviously, but also on the mainstream left in the aftermath of his assassination. I will call it a death cult. They worship death. They want their targets killed. And they've been supported by a huge apparatus. I'm talking about politicians who spread their propaganda and lies, NGOs, nonprofit groups, elected officials in the Democratic Party, and of course, journalists." End quote. The miasma of political flatulence exuded by the left is literally choking the life out of Western civilization. Western achievements in knowledge, art, and justice, truth, beauty, and goodness should be and could be an inheritance for all of humanity. But the American left is a death cult, hell-bent that we shall inherit only their foul wind. Political scientist Wilfred Riley, author of Lies My Liberal Teacher Told Me, debunking the false narratives defining America's school curricula, writes, quote, "Modern histories tend to rely heavily on the new ideological pieties of left-wing activists. First among these is the belief that we live in a totally corrupt and oppressive society, in fact, the world's most oppressive and corrupt society." End quote. This foundational untruth is identical in kind to the cultic doomsayings of utopians, millenarians, and fanatics the world over. It constitutes a kind of sacrifice, a ritualized assassination of the Western world intended to reinstate a, quote, primordial mythic moment, end quote, and reset the clock for the beginning of a new and perfect world conceived in the image of a leftist ideal. Mircea Eliade, to whom I referred in part 1 of this essay, observed that, quote, "The only profane activities are those which have no mythical meaning, which lack exemplary models," end quote. Written in 1954, Eliade's book, Cosmos and History, engaged the concern that the modern West was already undergoing a desacralization that rendered its enterprises profane by conducing to a sense of purposelessness cut off from a natural order. He states that in the archaic world, every responsible act in pursuit of a definite end assumed a ritualized aspect. All such acts require the evocation of mythic or cultural archetypes and a recapitulation of a paradigmatic sacrifice performed by a god at the beginning of time. Such a sacrifice is the proper origin of every cycle of the cosmos, and, quote, every sacrifice repeats the initial sacrifice and coincides with it. All sacrifices are performed at the same mystical instant as the beginning. Through the paradox of right, profane time and duration are suspended, end quote. The repetition of these ritualized gestures and the evocation of mythic archetypes thus restores the practitioner to a place of revelation outside time so that time can restart from there by their command and on their terms. This is how hierophants and ideologues operate. Only by linking back, the Latin word for which is religio, religion, can one move forward. Only by sacrifice can new life begin, or more aptly for the American left, only by killing something can one play God. A brief consideration of the themes and tropes of wokeism suffices to reveal the cultic nature and aspirations of the radical left. The eternal battle of oppressor and oppressed, delivering slaves from bondage, the radical hospitality of treating outsiders as wandering gods, demonizing political opponents and exorcising them from the new holy order, inquisitorial purity pogroms, burning heretics at the stake, magical transformations of the body and of identity, restoration of the sacred Edenic state of nature, incantatory language such as bespoke pronouns, land acknowledgments, and trigger warnings, supplicating gestures such as taking the knee and publicly kissing the feet of minorities, paying reparations as plenary indulgences to commute past sins, and the donning of liturgical vestments, kente cloths, keffiyehs, septum rings, and aposematic hair. Each of these represent a kind of sanctified abnegation and purification that allows the woke crusader to level up by leveling down, rewards in the holy world to come being greater than contamination in the impious one we now inhabit. The Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci once warned that in the interregnum, the space between political regimes, many morbid symptoms will appear, meaning that culture as well as nature abhors a vacuum. Leftist ideology fills the void left by the evacuation of faith and becomes itself a set of ritualized inversions intended to restore a relationship to a vanishing ideal, even if it never really existed or could exist. The conception of the individual as the locus of moral conscience in Judeo-Christian traditions was carried forward into the Western Enlightenment, establishing the right to equal justice under the law, the right to governance only with consent, and the right to pursue flourishing lives. These principles, foundational to Western democracy and the American experiment, have been turned upside down by the woke left and their philosophical and ideological ancestors. From Rousseau's conception of a noble savage, man is born free but is everywhere in chains, we get the Marxist critique of capitalism as a wholesale oppression and exploitation of the masses. And we get radical feminists deciding that a civilization conceived and literally built by men is essentially toxic and destructive and must be entirely redesigned according to their prerogatives. This torrent of utopian folderol has flowed through the sluices of various postmodern theories and become a totalizing critical doctrine that, far from solving problems, actively requires crisis to sustain itself. Any unequal outcome is and only is evidence of systemic oppression. Any unequal endowment at the level of the individual or the group is negated by denying biology and insisting on cultural relativism. Anyone can be anything or do anything, except, of course, those who have been doing the heavy lifting these last few millennia who are simply done for. The West is embroiled in an unwinnable conflict of visions. As the economist and social theorist Thomas Sowell has noted, leftists, with their unconstrained vision of a perfectly moral world and infinitely perfectible individuals, seek only the special causes of war, poverty, and inequality in order to eradicate them. Those with more constrained visions of human nature and society seek the specific causes of peace, prosperity, and individual flourishing in order to cultivate them. Sowell wrote in his book, Conflict of Visions, quote, "To those with the unconstrained vision, there must clearly be some cause of evils, but insofar as these causes are not so widely diffused as to be a part of human nature in general, then those in whom the evils are localized can be removed, opposed, or neutralized so as to produce a solution," end quote. Yes, a final solution, which is always imagined to usher in a new utopian age. Ignoring Solzhenitsyn's insight that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, the left insist on a Manichaean sorting of groups into good and evil people. They need a clear target for their social justice jihad because they cannot conceive that they could ever be on the wrong side of any moral matter. The constrained vision of human nature holds that if we can't live with what we are, we will never learn what we can become. The unconstrained vision of the woke left holds that if we cannot eliminate the specific causes of suffering and disparate outcome, usually identified as individuals, classes, factions, and institutions, we must destroy the system that produces it and them and start over. This radical vision insists on an unattainable ideal at all costs, the fate of civilization in the balance. The constrained vision, which is only a conservative vision insofar as it conditions restraint in the pursuit of liberal values, understands that there are no perfect solutions, only trade-offs. I think it is obvious that in the secularized West, a kind of hyper-rationality has reached its logical endpoint and given way to the paralogic of conversion disorders and ideological propaganda. As the meta-narratives of Western civilization have been deconstructed and discarded, many morbid symptoms have appeared. Primary crises of human survival having been substantially mitigated for much of the world, guess who? A certain kind of liberal project has nonetheless continued beyond compassion and into chaos, where the ontological distinctions on which all meaning depends have been erased and clumsily redrawn to preserve some distorted semblance of form and meaning just a bit longer before they become totally unrecognizable or utterly non-existent. The machines are coming! The machines are coming! Actually, they're already here, and they're creating their own members-only social media platforms now. This is the renorming and unnorming, not just of our cultural institutions, but of the primary categorical definitions and distinctions out of which all human understanding and progress are possible. Real challenges to flourishing in human dignity certainly still exist and always will, along with the necessary refinements of democratic and humanitarian projects in progress. But the left continually seek to exchange the good for the perfect, the real for the ideal, even if it is a pathological ideal, in order to achieve the mythic resonance that technocracy no longer allows. This is proving to be an unqualified ethical disaster. Psychiatrist and neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist suggests that a left-driven cultural shift toward consequentialist ethics and ends justifies the means emphasis on outcomes has led us to a dangerous pass. He offers the example of a surgeon about to perform a routine procedure on a patient who happens to have 5 healthy organs that meet the needs of 5 other patients who will die without them. To the consequentialist, it becomes a moral imperative to save 5 lives, even if it means sacrificing a healthy one who has no say in the matter. This reduction of ethics to outcomes and persons to parts is characteristic of totalitarian regimes and death cults, or as I like to refer to them, the woke left. Andrew Lobachevsky has defined this as part of a hystoroidal cycle in which hysterical conditions precipitate cultural collapse. Quote, "In the hystoroidal state before and during a societal crisis, radical ideologies take hold, especially among young people, intellectuals, and other bourgeois elites. Symptoms of this state include ignoring actual problems and their real causes and focusing on pseudo-problems and convenient but ineffective solutions. The inability to reason and judge evidence soundly, silencing sound criticism and amplifying radical voices, and giving overly charitable interpretations to trendy but unscientific ideas, end quote. Cults thrive on contradiction because paradox keeps practitioners turning and turning in the widening gyre of a second coming, always promised but never fulfilled, which is advantageous for those spinning such tales of transcendence and redemption. How else could women rage that their rights to birth control and abortion on demand, those modern guarantors of free and guiltless sex at will, are about to be taken away, which isn't true, and with equal ferocity support a movement like Me Too, which seeks to highlight their vulnerability to sexual exploitation, as if freedom to act somehow also means freedom from consequences or responsibility for one's actions. This is of a piece with the destabilizing fiction that men can become women and vice versa, because there are no real differences between us, which is evolutionarily just not the case physically, mentally, or emotionally. If women were just like men, they'd need a bit less emotional safety with their promiscuous sex, and if men were just like women, they wouldn't need to find a weaker opponent to beat up in the sports arena. They'd just destroy their reputations and livelihoods on social media, probably after claiming no consent and being believed immediately even though it was dark and no one else was around. Contradictions accumulate. A society that locks its doors has open borders. Minority populations with low achievement and high criminality have their academic standards and legal penalties reduced in the name of equity. Mental illness is valorized, chemically customized, and surgically tailored to the occasion, usually an autogynephilic rendezvous on OnlyFans. The most tolerant people in the freest countries in history are shamed and penalized for crimes they never committed. Homer, Orwell, and Vonnegut, to name just a few, had many cautionary words on such matters, but they are so lamentably dead white and male, and in a civilization built and secured by men's ability to invent and willingness to labor and die, their voices are no longer heeded, even if someone deigns to read them instead of Roxane Gay or Robin DiAngelo. It is not, nor it cannot come to good, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. If you know the source of this quote, there may yet be hope for you. In the meantime, Lobachevsky warns that, quote, when communities lose the capacity for psychological reason and moral criticism, the processes of the generation of evil are intensified at every social scale, whether individual or macro-social, end quote. This is a cumulative process. Every society contains and produces deranged and disturbed individuals. Some are competent, some are charismatic, and some, quote, impart meaning to their deviant lives by means of social hyperactivity. They create their own myths and compensatory ideologies and have the tendency to egotistically insinuate them to others. Their goals and ideas, which result from their deviant manner of experiencing, easily hook into the minds in which the sense and understanding of psychological realities has already started to deteriorate, end quote. Lobachevsky refers to these individuals as spellbinders, adept at organizing systems of moral and social destruction, instrumental in the formation and consolidation of pathocracies. One teeming medium for this cultural brain rot, as discussed in part 2 of this essay, is social media. Another is higher education and increasingly K-12 schools, where a preponderance of educators have metamorphosed into hardcore activists over the last 3 decades. These leftists agents provocateurs, really agents provocateurs, since most are women, no longer teach children how to think so much as who to hate, and how to weaponize grievance to gain social credits and ultimately power in a world they are destined to rule. Unless, of course, the children are straight, white, and ipso facto conservative males, in which case, if they grow up and say the wrong things, they might just have to be killed. Behavioral scientist and satirical critic of batshit leftism, Gad Saad, calls this characteropathy the parasitic mind, a mind taken over by idea pathogens that hijack reason, erase common knowledge, and redirect the behavior of the infected host toward the ideological goals of the viral agent, one of which is to spread the mind virus to other hosts. Quote, Parasitic pathogens are composed of thought patterns, belief systems, attitudes, and mindsets that parasitize one's ability to think properly and accurately. The afflicted victim loses the ability to use reason, logic, and science to navigate the world." End quote. Why bother when the woke left are determined to burn down the world in order to save it from itself? SAD diagrams a circular firing squad of conceptual categories and ideologies aimed at the heart of the liberal order of the Western world. These are postmodernism, social constructivism, political correctness, identity politics coupled with progressive self-flagellation, a culture of perpetual offense and victimhood, echo chambers, a void of intellectual diversity, cultural and moral relativism, and radical feminism. These are lethal predicates for the liberal project of the Western Enlightenment. My refrain has been that the American left is a death cult, and I submit that these are the very assassins of our culture and our future. With ruthless precision, the parasitized agents of this poneurological cult have wrought the following: the death of reason, logic, common knowledge, and error correction. Killer, postmodernism. The death of nature, and of a discoverable reality which allows us to understand our capacities and place in the order of things, and enhances our capacity for goodness when recognizing that no one is morally defined by just their gifts or their deficits. Killer, social constructivism. The death of democracy and the death of humor and the freedom of speech and expression on which they both depend, especially in their most challenging forms. Killer, political correctness. The death of merit, fellow feeling, common culture, and common cause. Killer, identity politics. The death of nuance, independent thought, self-respect, resilience, and responsibility. Killer, victimhood culture, and perpetual offense. The death of viewpoint diversity and the tolerance for challenge and debate that alone conduce to discovery, innovation, compromise, and true liberal democracy. Killer, echo chambers. The death of truth, empiricism, and standards for virtue and excellence in individuals and in cultures. Killer, cultural and moral relativism. The death of the family, of courtship and romance, of stable and rational social interactions and institutional operations, and of respect and gratitude for the unique capacities and sacrifices of men that have made civilization possible. Killer, radical feminism. One final casualty I am obliged to include is the death of art. This has been a long, agonizing expiration, and all of the causal factors outlined above have contributed. The aesthetic is not merely a momentary marvel or a background delight, an investment, a mark of sophistication, or a symbol of social status. It is an essential human expression that consolidates worldviews, identities, and values. Art is at once epistemological, a way of observing and knowing the world, and ontological, a mapping of the contents of the human mind and the human heart. Art is also a visual record of cultural evolution and history, the basis for understanding our place and time, and the source of all narrative. Art is the through line from a rational engagement with the world to our ineffable spiritual aspirations, or cosmic wonder if you prefer Carl Sagan. Only now it isn't. Art has become a twisted, narcissistic mix of political activism, virtue signaling, and malicious criticism, social justice propaganda sponsored by the woke left. Gratuitous race and gender swapping, insipid platitudes and banal homilies, rewritten histories, bowdlerized masterworks, and joyless, unimaginative ideological pandering to fragile midwits who need their safe spaces and boutique paint-by-number identities affirmed or avenged, never challenged or expanded. The death of art is the death of the imagination, and the death of the imagination is the death of possibility. Of all the unforgivable crimes against humanity and sins against philosophy, this may be the one that ultimately does us in as a civilization. When art, Poetry, literature, music, and cinema have nothing left to tell us save that we are and always have been monsters, and everything must be turned inside out and upside down. There is nothing left to say or see, especially when the old paintings are covered in soup and obscured by a coven of fools glued to their frames or to the floor in front of them. This is a vulgar, infantile tantrum, the negative dialectics of shit-smearing degenerate zeros. Picasso famously said that every child is an artist and the trick is to remain an artist when one grows up, which is hard to do on puberty blockers. He also said that art is a lie that makes us realize the truth. The sad truth is the American left are the people of the lie. Ponerology is the science of evil, its origins and macrosocial dynamics. The telos of ponerological systems is pathocracy, which Lobachevsky defines as a, quote, disease of mass social movements and ideologies, whether social, political, or religious, which infects entire societies, end quote. Based on decades of studying totalitarian regimes and the psychopathologies of their leaders, agents, and accomplices, he describes the consolidation of power through institutional and cultural mechanisms which destroy the old order through progressive purges, quote, until practically all social positions of influence are occupied by people with a variety of personality disorders and character disturbances, end quote. Cluster B disorders, Munchausen by proxy, body integrity identification disorder, assorted paraphilias. This is the world of the Western leftist, dear readers and listeners. They have been hollowing out the sacred precincts of our cultural institutions for decades. They have elevated fools and criminals. They have opened the gates for the barbarians, and they are hunting their political opponents. Lobachevsky places special emphasis on the indifference to or the reverence for criminals in the early stages of totalitarian orders. Quote, pathocracy is a pathological inversion of a normal social hierarchy in which social outcasts, criminals, and other psychological deviants rise to the top, end quote. Such societies, quote, are transformed into caricatures of themselves, defined by an inability to recognize pathological individuals as such, and they come to idolize and revere criminals, end quote. Sound familiar yet? Claudine Gay, president of Harvard University, plagiarist. Patrisse Cullors, Marxist lesbian founder of Black Lives Matter, defrauded donors of tens of millions of dollars to purchase mansions and fund unrelated nepotistic projects and lavish lifestyles. Boston University's anti-racism guru Ibram X. Kendi, née Henry Rogers, secured tens of millions of dollars in charitable funding for his Center for Anti-Racist Research and produced no research, just circular arguments, and then blamed racism for its shutdown. More grimly, Carmelo Anthony, DeCarlos Brown, Luigi Mangione, Tyler Robinson, murderers all, some with GoFundMes, one with a California ballot measure named in his honor, all the beneficiaries of grotesque leftist sympathy despite their homicidal mania. Then there are those with real political power in the Senate, in the White House, on the Supreme Court, who can't identify a woman, who use intelligence and security agencies to silence media and manipulate elections, and who openly mock the attempted and successful assassination of political opponents. Philosopher Jacob Howland laments that evil as such is hardly any longer treated as a subject in philosophy or theology, especially when it is so much in evidence in the world and seemingly metastasizing. Referencing the terrorism of the October 7th massacre in Israel, the horrifying execution of Irina Zarutska, and the shocking campus assassination of Charlie Kirk, Howland suggests that such atrocities are contextually repressed because they challenge the presupposition that our societies are characterized by stable moral structures. On Howland's account, evil is not merely the absence of good, but a, quote, demonic willfulness and primal instinct of death and destruction that Freud called thanatos, end quote. A force and a presence all its own, and our own. This is disturbingly evident in his examples. A Muslim student in America stating that after 9/11, the hijackers were just trying to start a conversation. Seems more like an ending to me. An expert on sexual violence dismissing the media's silence on the brutal rape of Israeli women on October 7th because rape is so commonplace. From hashtag believe all women to who fucking cares? Come a long way, baby. And in a revolting example provided by Janice Fiamengo, an article from Ms. Magazine ironically entitled American Masculinity as a Death Cult. Published one day after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, author Emily Taylor wrote that it was, quote, the violent discourse espoused by Charlie Kirk and many others that resulted in his murder in front of a crowd of thousands of students, end quote, and that Kirk, quote, built his career on racism and misogyny, end quote. So, as Liz Warren said of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, he was asking for it. This is classic cluster B confabulation, DARVO, disrupt, attack, reverse victim and defender. But the masthead of the periodical does remind readers that Ms. is, quote, more than a magazine, a movement, end quote. I can smell the truthiness of that movement through my computer screen. Philosopher Martin Boudry, responding with alarm to the undisguised leftist anti-Semitism after October 7th, gags at the, quote, crass portmanteaus, end quote, that appeared, Zion Nazism and Gaza cost. Darvo again. Of course, if there is a ground zero for borderline personality disorder anywhere in the world, it has to be the Gaza Strip. The rector of the University of Ghent, where Boudry teaches, has declared Israel's conduct unequivocally genocidal, stating to faculty that any who question the genocidal narrative are, quote, crossing a red line, end quote, and will not be protected from sanctions or worse by their academic freedom. I believe Howland is right. Evil is not the absence of good. It is the active extermination of it, a practice increasingly popular and theatrical on the left and with their mascots. Howland describes how the Hamas terrorists donned GoPros to make death porn, not just for their own jihadi cult, but for a world that sickly rejoices to blame the victims. He relates an account by a relief worker on a kibbutz upon finding the corpses of a murdered family. The father with his eyes gouged out, the mother with a breast cut off, the child missing its fingers. Hold these images in your minds, dear readers and listeners, and conjure the voiceover of the terrorists. You will never touch your mother and father again. You will never nurse your baby again. Carving out your eyes will hurt less than what you are about to see done to your wife and child. Is this evil enough? The GoPro footage of this grisly scene shows that the killers then sat down to a convivial meal amidst their slaughter. Amateur fiend Emily Taylor is the perfect ecstatic spectator for such sadism. Taylor characterized Charlie Kirk and men generally as lacking a moral compass due to a deep insecurity, being, quote, most afraid of their own irrelevance, end quote, and therefore going along with the, quote, death cult of hegemonic masculinity, end quote. Let me fix you a plate, dear. She finds it unsurprising that, quote, Trumpian Republicans are desperate to attack the very academic fields that lay their weaknesses bare, end quote, women's and gender studies. Honey, if you're going to lay me, one part anyway, is going to have to be bare. Taylor considers white supremacy and heteropatriarchy to be real and present dangers to society because women, non-binary, and trans people, quote, take the power away from having a penis, end quote. Thank you, good people, for allowing me to start my car with a key instead of my dick, which, by the way, still stands up on its own. It would be interesting to know what Taylor thinks of Kirk's killer, a radicalized leftist man and trans rights activist with a furry transgender lover. Taylor wrote that as the mother of a boy and a girl, her heart breaks for the America they are growing up in. Her dissembling surprises me less than her being able to distinguish her children's sexes. I'm sure this maternal regard does not extend to the children of Charlie Kirk. You know, sometimes I like to play a little game with language. Why should the woke have all the fun? So, stopping in the middle of this writing for a short linguistic thought experiment, I discovered that one anagram of radical empathy is archetypal maid. Like all fourth wave feminists, Emily Taylor is a legend in her own mind, and the one domestic chore still in the feminist repertoire is taking out the trash, which, as Taylor makes clear, includes all men and their tainted issue. Jacob Howland concludes his potent essay observing, quote, "Evil is not banal, but people are doing their best to make it so. To characterize the Hamas pogrom or Kirk's murder as understandable reactions to Palestinian suffering or right-wing provocation is to normalize evil, to pretend that it is something that we can control, a problem that reasonable people can solve over coffee and talk. More honest, though hardly less blameworthy, is to avert one's eyes, like the passengers who walked away from Irina Zarutska as she bled to death on the train." End quote. Of course, none of these responses adequately confront or account for evil, therefore they cannot arrest its progress. Death cults are apocalyptic by definition. They don't want evil to stop. They want to ride it like a bullet train to the next better world. The trolley dilemma for the American left is not a consequentialist conundrum, how to determine the proper conditions to sacrifice the hapless few for the ostensible good of the many. The woke left are Manichaeans, black and white thinkers obsessed with purity and the categorical imperative to take out the trash. Their minds were made up before they hopped the turnstile, and reason was not their ticket to ride. The American left is a death cult. All aboard! The 1960 film Inherit the Wind is a parable of the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. The actual legal drama concerned the then verboten teaching of evolutionary theory in public schools. The film and the play upon which it was based were vehicles for critiquing McCarthyism and the repression and persecution of political opponents. In the final scene, in the now empty courtroom, journalist E.K. Hornbeck, a cipher for the real-life H.L. Mencken, and attorney for the defense, Henry Drummond, Clarence Darrow, reflect on the true nature of the litigation, which resulted in the stress-related death of the prosecutor, the stentorian and formidable Bible-thumping Matthew Harrison Brady, William Jennings Bryant. Brady happened to be Drummond's great friend, as well as his lifelong adversary. Hornbeck. He delivered his own obituary. As he scrambles to find the Bible, Drummond quotes the very passage. Drummond, "He that troubleth his own house shall inherit the wind, and the fool shall be servant to the wise at heart." Hornbeck, "Well, we're growing an odd crop of agnostics this year." Drummond, "You know, Hornbeck, I'm getting damn sick of you." Hornbeck, "Why?" Drummond, "You never pushed a noun against a verb except to blow up something." Hornbeck, "You know, that's a typical lawyer's trick, accusing the accuser." Drummond, "What am I accused of?" Hornbeck, "Contempt of conscience, sentimentality in the first degree." Drummond, "Why? Because I refuse to erase a man's lifetime?" Hornbeck, "No, because you know what I thought of him and I know what you thought, so let's leave the lamentations to the illiterate. What is this? Be Kind to Bigots Week? Why should we weep for him? Because he's dead? You know what he was, that Bible-beating bunco artist." Drummond, "A giant once lived in that body, but Matt Brady got lost because he looked for God too high up and too far away." Hornbeck, "You hypocrite, you fraud, the atheist who believes in God. Why, you're just as religious as he was." Drummond, "Everything is grist for your mill, isn't it? Well, go ahead, grind it up. My God, don't you understand the meaning of what happened here today?" Hornbeck, "What happened here today has no meaning." Drummond, "You have no meaning. You're like a ghost pointing an empty sleeve and smirking at everything that people feel or want or struggle for. I pity you." Hornbeck, "You pity me?" Drummond, "Isn't there anything? What warms you? What touches you? Every man has a dream. What do you dream about? What do you need? You don't need anything, do you? People, love, an idea just to cling to? You poor slob. You're all alone. When you go to your grave, there won't be anybody to pull the grass up over your head. Nobody to mourn you. Nobody to give a damn. You're all alone." Hornbeck, You're wrong, Henry. You'll be there. You're the type. Who else would defend my right to be lonely? The scene closes with Drummond walking away with a Bible in one hand, tradition, wisdom, poetry, and The Origin of Species in the other, reason, evidence, curiosity. Unafraid of questions that can't be answered and prepared to challenge answers that can't be questioned, Drummond represents the mature, integrated democratic citizen, one who reconciles private desires with public obligations and subjective preferences with empirical facts, ethics consisting in the artful balancing of each with the other. This is the parable for our time. The Western world has become a courtroom, a battleground of dispassionate rationality against radical subjectivity, free speech against compelled groupthink, sensible tolerance against suicidal empathy. In the film, the prosecutor, as Hierophant, unable to break the defendant's argument, breaks his spirit by weaponizing the people he loves against him. The defense attorney, as loyal opposition, is denied by the court the witnesses crucial to his case and must engage the prosecutor and his faith on their own terms. Later accused of contempt, he objects and is tested. Is it possible that something is holy to the celebrated agnostic? The defense responds, quote, yes, the individual human mind. In a child's power to master the multiplication table, there is more sanctity than in all your shouted amens and holy holies and hosannas. An idea is a greater monument than a cathedral, and the advance of man's knowledge is a greater miracle than all the sticks turned to snakes or the parting of the waters, end quote. Only now children multiply pronouns, teachers sanctify murderous memes, ideologies interdict ideas, men have turned into women, and the floodgates have been opened on the West. In his final argument before the jury, Drummond concludes, quote, progress has never been a bargain. You have to pay for it. You can have a telephone, but you lose privacy and the charm of distance. Madam, you may vote, but at a price. You lose the right to retreat behind the powder puff or your petticoat. Mister, you may conquer the air, but the birds will lose their wonder and the clouds will smell of gasoline, end quote. Again, there are no ultimate solutions to the problems we face or the ones we create as we advance in our understanding and our development. Only trade-offs. And only totalitarians insist, usually with a finger on the trigger, that the only acceptable solutions must be perfect and final. The Origin of Species on trial is actually a case for the future of our species. In the end, the prosecutor wins the battle but loses the war and dies of an overfull belly, his eyes too big for his stomach. Revolutions do tend to eat their own. Earlier in the story, there is a poignant exchange that discloses the true nature of this conflict. The counselors meet as old friends and discuss their relationship apart from their duties of care. Brady: there used to be a mutuality of understanding, of admiration between us, Henry. Why is it, my old friend, that you've moved so far away from me? Drummond: well, all motion is relative, Matt. Maybe it's you who moved away by standing still. In our world, the Overton window has moved. The range of ideas now considered acceptable in public discourse and policy are batshit crazy and antithetical to liberal democracy. Distance has developed because of the progress of reason and the stasis of dogma. The woke left believe they are challenging an oppressive tradition, revealing new truths that will improve the world. In fact, the leftist narrative is anything but revolutionary. It is regressive, anti-liberal, totalitarian, a very old story repackaged with dubious claims and inscrutable language, but with an unlimited advertising budget. In their bid to achieve the mythic, the left pitch their revival tent in the place of excrement, then demand that the rest of us clean up our acts. Knowing that most cannot or will not comply, they are prepared to do what it takes to solve the problem and then dance on our graves. And when those with two left feet are calling the tune, eventually it's ashes, ashes, we all fall down. The American left is a death cult. I rest my case.